The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Welcome back to a two-part special with United States Senate Republican nominee candidate Dave McCormick. And Dave, as we signed off for part one, we're back here. So thank you for helping us out with this. And we had left off saying we need to talk about the border. I've run out of words over the last 4 years since Biden and Mayorkas became the director of Homeland Security. The word pejorative doesn't quite cover, because even that's not enough. I have done at least double-digit views on it, and it doesn't get any better. So it's a broad topic, and I'm going to give you free rein to talk about it. We'll go through all the points. I think to set it up, though, and maybe to encapsulate my anger as an American citizen, is when I just read, apparently, our impeached Director of Homeland Security for violating the Constitution and his oath of office to protect the borders of America as part of his job. Protect and prevent evil, terrorists, jihadists, drug mules from the cartels flowing into our country to help destroy it. The Republicans have filed articles that he violated that oath. But in his response to those serious charges, he recently signed an executive order right from the Director of Homeland Security that went out to order all Border Patrol agents that are protecting us that in engagement with any migrant that comes over our border, legally or illegal, or however they get caught, if the conversation goes past a few sentences for some reason, that they should immediately inquire the preferred pronoun of choice for this. Take it. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go.
But it's so indicative of a fundamental misunderstanding of the crisis that we face. And if we would have on day one of the Biden administration said, how bad could it get? I mean, how bad could it get? It is so much worse than we would have ever imagined on a number of different dimensions. Number one, national security. National security is absolutely been compromised. We have 10 million illegal migrants that have come into the country. We have very little understanding where most of them are. They're not from Mexico and Venezuela. They're from Syria, the Middle East. They're from all over.
Iran.
Right. They're from all over.
Hamas.
160 last year, Chuck, you know this, were captured, apprehended, that were on the terrorist watch list. Those are the ones that were apprehended, right? It took 13 people to take down the towers. The national security, we are going to pay a price for this. We just don't know what it is yet. Second, there's the economic cost. These sanctuary cities, the benefits at a time when, as we talked about in our last segment, where we have enormous and growing debt, our economy spiraling out of control, we're now funding the benefits for illegal immigrants that surpass the benefits that ordinary Americans have every day. But then the third thing, which is the thing that animates, the thing that gets people in Pennsylvania most focused, is fentanyl. The fentanyl crisis is a huge threat to our country. 4,000 Pennsylvanians died last year from fentanyl, 100,000 across the country. And I went down to the border in the last election. I was with the Border Patrol. They pointed up into the hedgerow. There was guys from the cartel sending people across the Rio Grande. They come across, they have fentanyl with them in many cases. They're pushed, they apply for amnesty, they're released into the economy. It takes 48 hours for them to make their way to northeastern United States. They come down Route 80, Route 81, 76, and into Pennsylvania, into small towns like Bloomsburg, where I grew up. And this fentanyl crisis is pervasive. It's cheap, it's addictive, they're using it, cutting it into all these things.
And killing us, killing our kids.
Killing our kids, and we have to take this as the threat that it is. So on my first day in the Senate, I would be proposing legislation that would use our military to go after the cartels. And that's a big statement. As a military man, I don't say that easily. Right. But when we're killing 100,000 Americans a year, we would go in there, we have precision technology, we have the drones, and take out those cartels. Those fentanyl ingredients come from China into Mexico. They're manufactured there. It's in the hands of the cartels, and it comes across our border. This is an insidious attack on America from the cartels, from China, from bad actors around the world.
Iran.
And we have to treat it as the threat it is. And the thing I would say is, don't. It's another one of those from our last conversation, the walnut and the pea, where Biden is trying to change the conversation. Bob Casey is trying to change the conversation. They're trying to make this about the legislation that was proposed, which was bad legislation a couple months ago by a bipartisan.
It was stuff for their Green New Deal, for Christ's sake.
What they don't acknowledge is that Joe Biden has much of the executive authority he needs to stop this now. And Bob Casey, my mom's from Punxsutawney. Bob Casey's a little bit like Punxsutawney Phil. He's this Punxsutawney Bob. He pops his head up in an election year and he's talking about fentanyl and the crisis on the border. No. Bob Casey voted for sanctuary cities. Bob Casey voted against $800 million for the Border Patrol. Bob Casey voted against Kate's Law, which treated illegal immigrants as felons when they came back in and prosecuted them. Bob Casey has been at the scene of the crime for our border crisis, and nothing he or Joe Biden can say is going to change that. And it has to be addressed. And the best way to address it, frankly, is a new president in the White House, President Trump in the White House, and a new majority in the Senate that can actually solve this problem. It's a solvable problem. We just need leadership.
Yeah. Well, one of the great hypocrisies, back to the Senate bill, the Democrats have screamed out loud, see, we're trying to get this progress. We're trying to address the border crisis. And it was the Republicans that shanghaied it. So they're talking out of two ends of their mouth. That's a lie. That's a bald-faced lie. First of all, let me be clear about something. The President of the United States, without the passage of one bill, one regulation, right now under our existing code of regulations and our statutes, and his constitutional authority as president, has full authority to shut down our border, to go after the cartels, to your point. We don't even need a bill. He could do that.
Right.
And completely shut down our border. And here's what's happening instead. We just said we have a majority of American working, law-abiding citizen, God-fearing Americans who can't feed their families, who can't put their hands on $1,000, 60% live paycheck to paycheck, to your point. We're handing out, with their tax dollars, destinations unknown, plane tickets, paid plane fare to these illegal migrants coming over our border. We don't even know where they got. They're dispersed into the country.
Right. And Chuck, the thing that you probably saw this in the last budget, Senator Haggerty proposed an amendment which Bob Casey and all the Democrats voted against. But right now, those illegal immigrants are counted in the census. The reason that's so important is the census determines how many congressional seats each state gets. So if all those illegal migrants go to blue states, as an example, those blue states get more congressional seats. And of course, what happens with that? They get more votes in the Electoral College. So you talk about something that changes the future of democracy. It's having illegal migrants that are counted in the census that weights the outcome of the election much more in the direction of Democrats. And this is the motivation, has to be the motivation behind what's happening. It makes no sense in any other way. And it's purely political. And we need leadership to fix it. And it's not going to come from Joe Biden or Bob Casey.
We have governors standing up for their sovereignty.
Yeah.
The governor of Texas,
Yeah.
the governor of Florida. We have the Biden administration, when they put up barriers to prevent the illegal immigrants, which our president is constitutionally bound to enforce. Right? Last time what I remember about civic class, because I wasn't paying attention then, was pretty simple. Congress passes the laws. The courts interpret the laws.
Yeah.
The president enforces the laws. Do you know if we had a sample 100 students now and ask them, they think the president gets to make the laws. They don't even understand how our government works. The president enforces the laws, which our president is not doing. So, like back to where I was going, we have, and I like your comment on it, we have our United States government attacking governors of border states who are trying to protect American citizens that they're not doing. So,
yeah, listen, I mean, I think what we're seeing here is an administration that is 100% failing on the most basic responsibilities of government, which is to protect its citizens, to create opportunity for all, and ultimately to get out of the way and let free enterprise prosper. On all three fronts, this administration is hurting Americans, is hurting working Americans the most. And on the border, listen, if you're Governor Abbott, you have to protect your citizens. You have to secure the border. So I support 100% what he's doing.
Right.
And what President Biden's doing is really undermining the very sovereignty of the United States. It's the single most important thing you do as a president is to protect the sovereignty of your citizens and your nation. And he's not doing that. So honestly, I think the only way to fix this is to replace him. I really mean that. I really mean that. I think we're now to the point where we have a choice. There's a fork in the road. And the fork in the road is whether we think the country is in deep distress and headed in the wrong direction and in need of new leadership, or whether we think the status quo is okay. Right. And I think for all the reasons we've talked about, and this is why 80% of Pennsylvanians think we need change. And that's why I'm so optimistic that I'm going to win this election. And I know that Casey has named 30 years, and he's been in public life, and his father obviously was an iconic figure. But this is really a race in Pennsylvania between a career politician who's voted 98% of the time with Joe Biden and who can be held accountable because of his votes for spiraling inflation, for an attack on fossil fuels in our energy sector, for the crime that's spiraling out of control in our cities, and for a border that is absolutely indefensible. It's that person, that status quo politician, against someone who's never served in elected office, who's truly an outsider, who's served in our military, who's created jobs in Pennsylvania, and who has worked at the highest levels of government, and who is going for the sole purpose of making change. I'm not looking for a job. I don't need a job. If I win this Senate seat, that will not be success. Winning this Senate seat and then going to Washington to make change will be the reason that I will declare victory. And that's what this election's about, just not for me, but for the country. And that's why it's so important. And I hear that, Chuck, everywhere I go, the sense of fear, the sense of dread. We haven't talked about internationally. Maybe we can talk for a minute about that. But what's happening at home, we've talked about. It's very scary, the spiritual decline at home. So you go to our college campuses and you see these kids marching, and they don't know the difference between good and evil. Right. There's Jewish kids at Penn hiding in their dorms because they fear for their safety. And you say, my God, and by the way, only a third of them think America's exceptional and are very patriotic. Right. And you say, my God, how could that happen? And then you watch those 3 college presidents testify, and you say, oh, that's how it happened. Right. The lack of leadership, the lack of moral clarity. So we're in deep trouble at home, but I'm also deeply afraid of what's happening around the world. As I mentioned to you, my wife and I went to Israel immediately.
That was the next subject, so we're in it. Go ahead.
Immediately after Christmas. And we went through Kfar Aza, which was one of the communities that was attacked, 800 residents. 100 Israelis were butchered in Kfar Aza that day. Chuck, you can't believe it. The families burned, parents killed in front of their children, decapitations. I mean, the brutality. We talked to a young... Evil. And you can't live side by side with that level of evil. Hamas has to be eradicated. Right. We should support Israel in every step of the way in doing that. But this wasn't just about Hamas against Israel. This is about Hamas against the West. And it wasn't just Hamas. It's Hezbollah, it's Islamic Jihad, it's the Houthis.
It's Iran.
All supported by Iran. And Iran is the country that we've given more than $100 billion back to from sanctions, which it's used to underwrite these terrorists. That was President Obama, that was President Biden, and the deciding vote of the original sin was Bob Casey. In 2015, he voted for the Iran deal. Even to this day, he defends that, and that's part of the reason we have the challenge in the Middle East. But it's not just there. It's Russia's invasion into Ukraine. It's China rattling its saber in Taiwan. So what I say on the campaign trail, I really mean it. I'm 58. I was a soldier during the Cold War when we talked about nuclear annihilation. Yeah. I was in the first wave of troops into Iraq in the Gulf War. I was the Undersecretary of Treasury during the 2008 financial crisis, where we thought we were headed to the next Great Depression. In my adult life, I've never been more worried about the possibility of things outside our borders taking us in a direction that we lose control. So that's the crisis we're in. And that's the crisis that Americans have to wade into when they vote. What kind of change, what kind of leadership do we need in a time of crisis?
Right. Well, a couple things, and a couple different areas I want to talk about. One, I'm literally coming off a view I just did, an editorial opinion that ran in a show, actually the show with Congressman Dan Muser, this effectively eviscerating the hypocrisy of Chuck Schumer and the Democrats on his loathsome, vile, disgusting, and despicable pandering speech that he gave effectively in the middle of a war, suggesting Israel topple its government, throw out its prime minister, give sanctuary to Hamas in Rafah and let them refortify their positions, call for a humanitarian ceasefire, and effectively threaten Israel that if you don't do this, we're going to insinuate the American government, the USA, is going to help shape your government, use whatever leverage we have. Dave, I listened to that speech and I thought, is this America?
Right.
Am I in America? So I want to cover just a couple points and then get your comment. Point number one is this. And I actually said in my view, that would have been the equivalent of Winston Churchill, one of our allies, after we had stayed out of the war, and now we come in with the Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor, calling for the removal of FDR, President Roosevelt, because he was asleep at the switch and we should have known it was coming, and we need a new change in leadership that's more sympathetic to the Nazis, that they can, the equivalent of.
Yeah.
The other part about hypocrisy, the call for humanitarian aid, and that all sounds good. Let me give you a couple of stats. I just had Craig Snyder on my show. He was just in Israel. Craig Snyder was the chief of staff to former United States Senator Arlen Specter when he was the head of the Senate Committee on Intelligence. He just got back from 2 weeks in Israel. So he knows a little bit about what's going on in Israel. He talked to me about the atrocities. He was on the ground there. So getting back to Israel, this humanitarian, and we talked about statistics. These are United Nations statistics. The average casualties of civilians in any hot war is 9 to 1 for every soldier killed.
Yeah.
Israel has kept it under 2 to 1. They've done everything they could to protect civilians. But back to the point. So, but when we invaded Normandy and we had D-Day, you know well from West Point grad, the loss of life of American soldiers to establish a beachhead in Normandy.
Enormous.
Right, enormous. And the loss of American soldiers in our island hopping campaign to get to the Japanese mainland against Japan. That would be like, once we established our beachhead, why don't we have a humanitarian ceasefire? Do you know how many civilians were killed ultimately tragically in Germany as a cost of their war of aggression in Germany? They're the ones that started the war.
Yeah.
They've used human beings as shield, and they're blaming Israel for protecting its existence. So your comment on that first.
Well, first of all, just go back to 9/11. Remember how we felt on 9/11? I mean,
patriotic.
I was like,
together.
Sign me up. I want to go.
Right.
I want to go find
Many
him.
people did.
I want to go dig him out of a hole, and I want to kill him myself.
Yeah.
Like that's why the way we all felt at 9/11, and that's the way you feel when your country is attacked. And so I couldn't agree more. The other thing that is happening, and it's deeply cynical, but Hamas has embedded itself into the civilian population. Its headquarters are below
hospitals,
Gazan hospitals, right? It's blocked the humanitarian corridors. It's made it as difficult as possible to protect. And listen, when I see pictures of women or babies, I mean, it's heartbreaking. Human suffering is heartbreaking. But I'm 100% with you that Israel is conducting itself in a way that's doing everything it can to minimize civilian casualties, and it can't stop until Hamas is destroyed. Because if it stops prematurely and Hamas reconstitutes it, it'll be a bigger, worse problem later. And as I said, you can't live side by side with people who want to slit your throat in the middle of the night.
No. So, and then there's another part of, again, back to the Israel issue with Schumer. The other part of his thrust of his speech was they have to remove Netanyahu and throw out their prime minister. Well, first of all, back to hypocrisy. The last vote in the Knesset was 95-4 or 94-5 in support of Netanyahu handling the war. Secondly, that the one that they would choose to replace him would be a member of the war cabinet that, even though they disagree with Netanyahu and just about everything,
100% on the war.
100% agree with him
Right.
and would do and look, Schumer knows all this.
Right.
And then let me get back to one more hypocrisy, Dave. This call, especially for the students on campus, and especially for Rashida Tlaib's Dearborn, Michigan constituency, the Democrats are worried is going to cost Biden the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
That they're appealing to with this garbage rhetoric by Schumer is that this two-state solution.
Yeah.
Well, I've studied my history and I've talked to people that know it. American presidents have been calling for a two-state solution all the way back to Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger in the 1970s,
right,
after the Six-Day War. And it didn't happen. And it's not going to happen because what I learned from all of this hypocrisy, diplomacy the Democrats have, they don't want it. Not Israel. They do not want. They want to annihilate every Jew in Israel from the river to the sea, as the slogan goes. And you know why we don't have it? Because they don't want it. Right. So when they say we need to replace Netanyahu to get somebody who will work toward a two-state solution that they know, the Democrats know, they don't want.
Well, it's premature. The war has to finish to figure out what comes after the war. But you've touched on something that I really feel strongly about, which is we see in ways that shocked me. I'm not Jewish, but it shocked me, and maybe if I was Jewish, it wouldn't have surprised me as much, but the way anti-Semitism has popped up all over the place. And this is a moment where it's a test. And we're seeing many of our public officials being tested for moral clarity and many failing. And
Schumer,
Liz McGill,
Biden.
Schumer. And frankly, we have in Pittsburgh, Summer Lee, who has been incredibly vocally anti-Semitic in defense, and she's been endorsed by a number of people, including Bob Casey, Senator Casey, who I've called upon again and again to say, listen, withdraw that endorsement. You can't stand with Israel and be opposed to anti-Semitism and still endorse Summer Lee. And this is where, listen, politics is first and foremost about being an American. So I'm much more of an American than I am a Republican.
Right.
And so when John Fetterman, who would have been my opponent had I won the primary, and I'm sure if John Fetterman and I said that, we'd disagree on like 95% of things.
I'm with Fetterman on that.
Me too.
100% with him.
He has had the courage.
Moral clarity.
To speak out with moral clarity, and others, including Senator Casey, have not. And I think this is a moment. And what we need now in this moment of crisis for our country, whatever someone thinks, it's a time to speak out and say, where do you stand on such things? Let the American people choose, not just on Israel, but on everything, because this a time for timidity, a time for keeping your head down is gone. This is a time for leaders to step up and get our country moving in the right direction. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, 80% of Pennsylvanians and 80% of Americans think we're headed in the wrong direction. Certainly we can agree that we need leadership to fix it.
Agreed. Let's turn our attention, as we are now on the world stage, and you will deal with, as United States Senator, the world stage. We haven't, mostly, you mentioned, I think, in passing on another answer in part one. We haven't even really gotten into China.
Yeah.
The existential threat that China presents. They control our supply chain for our Go Green electric greening of America and electric car batteries and electric cars, which they control. They're trying to corner the market on the microchips and are using and engage in espionage to infiltrate Silicon Valley to find out where. Thankfully, the biggest manufacturer of those chips, I think, Dave, is actually a Taiwanese company that does that, and they're our allies, which now gets us into the conflict between China and Taiwan. And if they confiscate, and there's forfeiture there, and they would actually have control even over some of our issues like microchips. Take it anywhere you want about the existential threat that China presents to us.
It's an enormous threat. The book that we talked about when I came on your show, Superpower in Peril, was really about how we remain the world's superpower in competing against China. And listen, here's what's happened. 20 years ago, there was a bipartisan consensus of trying to bring China into the global trading system. And the hope was that we would get access to Chinese markets and ultimately make China more benign. That was a terrible decision. China has proven itself to be exactly opposite what we expected. They steal our intellectual property. And under President Xi, they are directly coming at us to replace us as a global superpower with technology development and so forth. And so I think I'm uniquely qualified to deal with this. I'm a military man. I understand China's military capabilities. I have negotiated with the Chinese in government 10, 15 years ago. I've done business in China. I know what we're dealing with China, and we need a significantly tougher line in how we deal with them. And I laid this out in a speech recently, but just 4 or 5 things. Number one, we need to stop our dependence on China for lithium batteries and solar panels. 2, we need to kick China out of the World Health Organization. 3, we need to take back the preferred nation status that we gave China because they haven't lived up to their deal. 4th, we need to stop U.S. companies and investors from investing in China's military or investing in the Communist Party. 5th, we need to stop the strategic purchase of farmland by the Chinese. They bought like 400,000 acres of farmland over the last few years. We need to go tough. And finally, we need to stop the flow of fentanyl from China, which we talked about. That fentanyl, those fentanyl ingredients come from China. We need to treat that as the threat that it is. That's the kind of tough-minded approach we need to have with China. And our current leadership in the Senate has been very weak-kneed on this. Senator Casey's been very weak-kneed at this. He'll come at me on China. I'm saying to him, listen, you've been in the Senate for 18 years. You presided over this. What are you doing, man? Do something about China.
Right.
Unfortunately, he and others have done nothing, and we need people that actually understand the threat and know what to do about it.
We haven't even mentioned the fact that by all credible evidence, the greatest pandemic in the last 100+ years that has hit the world came from a lab in Wuhan in China.
That's why I said the World Health Organization. So here we go. Perfect example. So we know COVID originated in Wuhan, right? It cost us trillions of dollars, millions of lives, and China from the very first day never gave us the information, the data, what happened. Had we had that, we might, and that's why I think they should be thrown out of the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization, in my mind, should potentially be disintegrated because it stood by China and didn't stand up for science and how to actually deal with the pandemic.
That segues in, while we're going to be shutting and punishing Americans, shutting down our energy, hurting our national security capacity, our military defense capabilities, and punishing and killing Americans who are going to face a choice of heat or eat as we go completely and totally green. As that's going on, 8 of the top 13 polluting cities in the world
are in China. Yeah. No. I think when we look back, even though the border right now is front and center, I think when we look back, we may say the greatest strategic miscalculation of the Biden administration was not China, but energy policy. Right. What I mean by that is they've attacked fossil fuels. In doing so, they've undermined our national security. Instead of being a next exporter of natural gas, we could help our allies stand against our adversaries. They've hurt our economy. Those are great paying jobs. I was in Tunkhannock the other day. 22 graduates of Lackawanna College. They're starting at $65,000 a year, right out of the gate, 19, 20-year-olds. And it hurts our environment. Because if we export our natural gas, Pennsylvania is the 4th largest natural gas reserves in the world. Right. If we export our natural gas, it replaces coal-fired plants in India and China. And so this, and to make it matters worse, as you said, because we've mandated all this EV stuff and solar and wind and so forth, we've made ourselves hugely dependent on China for lithium batteries and solar panels. And we'll look back on this and we'll say, oh my God, we've hurt ourselves on so many dimensions. I'm a strong conservative, I'm a Republican. No Democrat, progressive, Bob Casey, no one else is going to say they're more committed to the environment or conservation than me. It's a false choice. And it's because the progressive left has hijacked the Democratic Party.
Agreed. And then you get to, hypocrisy is a word that's big for me and the National Democrats. And then you get back to the issue of, while they're having everybody go and buy electric cars that no one wants, by the way.
Right.
Do you know that under 7% of new car purchases, Dave, in 2023 were not for electric vehicles?
Yeah.
Okay. And do you know that every major car manufacturer has suffered north of $5 billion in losses? You know the average loss for Ford and GM per car, their electric vehicles, their average, $36,000 per car is the loss. And the GM, or the CEOs and presidents of those major American manufacturers said, we're done. Yeah. We're done with the new car.
And that's on top of the billions of dollars, trillions of dollars of subsidies that you and I are paying.
Yeah. Well, as our time runs out, so I'll make one final point of hypocrisy. So they're pushing these electric cars at everybody. Every commercial is on an electric vehicle, get an electric vehicle. By the way, they're 80% more likely to break down, and they're just left and they have to be towed off the road. They don't work too good in the winter. The range, they lose 50% range. So on top of all that, here's the hypocrisy again. When they go to plug in their clean energy electric vehicle, it's the energy, since they don't produce their own, it comes from coal-fired power plants. Look, and diesel fuel, dirty diesel. And apparently they don't want to talk about
details.
That stuff. Yeah, details. Well, Dave, our time is out.
Good to see you.
It's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for the time. We're able to do 2 parts. The issues to discuss appropriately, we needed some time for. So I thank you.
Having me, always.
And again, God bless and good luck on your
I'll be back a lot. You'll see a lot of me, I'm afraid.
You'll have a standing mic. Open
Could
mic.
I say, just if your listeners want to learn more about me, it's at Dave McCormick.
Talk to the middle camera.
Yeah, if your listeners want to learn more about me, it's at DaveMcCormickPA.com. Look forward to seeing you on the campaign trail.